This lecture is going to be on industrialization and basically women working in the factories and women working as laborers. When you talk about women working as laborers, the North, when you're talking about 1814 and then on, there's going to be a huge expansion of industry. And so your northern factories are always looking for laborers and they always need laborers. And so you definitely are going to see the factories really looking towards women to be factory workers. Women, when they come in to get paid with the factories, actually when women get paid at all, they get paid less than men. But definitely very obvious in the factories because you have men and women working in the factories, and women will always get less even though they're doing the same work. When you talk about factory workers, African Americans, men or women, it doesn't matter, really aren't considered as laborers. So you really don't see them in the factories at this point in time. Okay, I'm going backwards in time, but I think it's definitely appropriate for this time period. In a report from Alexander Hamilton in 1791, he will say that factories should be encouraged to hire women as not to take men from the fields. And so it really began to really encourage women to go into the factories, and so men can be working the farms. So when you're talking about 1814, there's going to be a huge push to build up the United States industries. We know that cotton has expanded, and because you have this huge growth of expansion of cotton, all the cotton is going to go north into the industries, and you're going to have a huge boom in the textile industries. Textiles are anything cloth related. And there's going to be a huge promotion to women for women to work in the factories just because they definitely need workers in the factories. And so with that, you're going to see a huge movement of people, and this is definitely including women, to move towards the cities and move into the cities to take factory jobs. Okay, so one of the issues about women working in the factories and women working in these cities is that families are kind of concerned about their young daughters. And when I say young daughters, I mean kind of like 17 to early 20s of them, being by themselves, being in a city, working, in industry and an industrial job. And so because of that concern, you're going to have the creation of what's known as the Lowell system. The Lowell system is going to be created by a man by the name of Francis Lowell, and he's going to basically really perfect the factory system. And to encourage women to work in his factories, he's going to have what's known as the Lowell system. In some books, it's also known as the Waltham system. In actuality, Lowell created it, and then when other factories adopt it, they call it something else. Okay, so the Lowell system. It was a way to encourage young women to work at the factories. And so what they will do is they will promise things and make it very appealing for young women to work in the factories. They will provide one meal a day for the girls. They will also provide basic kind of like a dorm right next to the factory. So they had a place to stay and to sleep. They were promised one meal a day that they weren't responsible for. And then also they were paid a little bit higher than basically what the going rate for women in factories were. So actually, in the very beginning, the Lowell system actually paid women, I would say, fairly well. I mean, it's not going to make them rich at all, but it was a little bit better than what other factories were paying at the time. Another thing that they would do, like in the dorms, they would set up libraries. They would have libraries. They would encourage the girls to meet the other girls in the factories and kind of have kind of like social hour, if you will, after work. And then also they promised the families that the girls would go to church on Sundays. And so this is known as the Lowell system, and it really worked. It encouraged and really got young women into the factory system, and it worked for a while. It worked for a good amount of time. I would say 1814, 1815 until about 1830. So we'll roughly call it kind of 15 years that it worked. The reason why it's going to die out is that in the 1830s, it's actually going to become too expensive, and then it'll just die out because it's too expensive. I will get there, but in the 1830s, you're going to start to see the movement of immigrants coming into the United States. When immigrants come into the United States, they will take factory jobs, and they will take any pay factory jobs. So they will take very low paying jobs. And so you could have one company hire immigrants paying very low wages, and they weren't providing dorms and meals, and the owners were making more of a profit. And so people who are running the Lowell system or the Waltham system were saying, well, wait a minute, I'm not making as much profit. And people are actually getting people to work, or women to work, at very low wages. And so your Lowell/Waltham system will definitely die out by the 1830s. But in the very beginning, it definitely worked. Okay. Talked about that. Okay, so when you have women in the factories, they're really referred to as mill girls. And in a sense, I kind of refer to mill girls when you're younger, but you kind of still have that connotation or that name that's associated with women working in the factories as mill girls. At the end of the day, the work is entry level. You can usually learn a skill within like 1 to 2 days. So it's basically an unskilled job that they're taking. Low wages, except for the Waltham system for a period, or the Lowell system for a period of time. But they're very long hours. And it's harsh conditions in the sense because there's no air conditioning, there's no heating. So in a sense, you kind of work in the elements. You've got machinery going around all the time whenever you're there. And so you kind of always have the hum of machinery going. You're always working. You can work anywhere from 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. And you get very few breaks. You usually get a lunch break around-ish 45 minutes, and then you might get one other short break, which might be like a 10 to 15 minute break. But I'm talking like 12, 14 hours. So that's actually not a lot of time to actually have a break. You're not getting paid that much. You have really poor conditions, and there's definitely no job security. If you don't go to work, you could actually lose your job because they need working people. And if you're not there, you're not a productive worker. So there was no job security. I mean, and you could be calling off because you are truly sick. And there's really no job security. And then God forbid you get really sick where you have a fever and bronchitis or pneumonia or whatever, and you would be off for like a week or two. You're not going to have a job at the end of that. Another thing is that if you get injured, even if you get injured on the job and you can actually not function, then you basically lose your job. So there's definitely no job security. The conditions are very low or very poor. And there's really nothing you can do about it, because if you complain about it, they'll say, well, find another job. I don't care. You don't have to work here. I'll find somebody else to replace you. For the most part, the United States had the large population that it could easily replace their factory workers. So at this point in time, if you didn't like the job or you complained about it, they'd be basically saying, I don't need you to be here at work complaining. So the fact is you don't complain and you put up with the really long hours and the really poor conditions. Now, having said that, you have men and women working in the factories. You're also going to have child labor. You're going to have factory workers that will eventually marry and have kids, and they will definitely bring their kids into the factories, because they don't have a huge amount of people to watch them. And so at some point in time, they usually bring their children in. It's actually fairly young, probably around 4 or 5. They would definitely bring their children to work. A 4 and 5-year-old can go, if you're in a textile factory, you can go pick up the empty bobbins of the empty thread, and the little 4 or 5 years old can go pick up the bobbins and put them in a tin can. And it gets them used to the factory. And then as they get older, they can do a little more responsibility, And when you're talking about 6, 7, they can actually hold down a job. They can actually learn how to sew. They can actually do work. Once children are able to do a fair amount of work, the children can get paid. And it's going to be less than women, so it's going to be the lowest pay. But the fact is that factory workers need their children to be working and to get paid so they can contribute the money to the family, which they desperately need. And then, so also when you talk about that, it puts the family basically in the cycle of poverty, and it puts them in a cycle that the kids are in the factories, and then they're going to grow up and be in the factories, and then they're going to marry somebody in the factory, and then you just have this cycle that you really can't get out of. Now, having said about that cycle, the hope and the dream for a woman working in a factory is that they're going to meet somebody not, well, two things. They're either going to meet somebody not in the factory who is basically economically above them, and they'll fall in love with that person, and then they don't have to work in the factories. They'll fall in love, get married, and then they can move out of the factories. Another hope and dream is that if you do meet a fellow factory worker and you get married, is that your husband will be promoted to manager or supervisor, and the pay will increase, and that means you're middle class, and therefore the woman doesn't have to work. Does that happen very often? No. It does happen, but it's basically the lucky few that get into that situation. It's the hope and dream, basically, of any mill girl, but it rarely happens. And also, marrying somebody outside the factory, that does not happen very often, because if you're in a factory 12, 16 hours a day, you're around factory people. You're not really going to get an opportunity to meet somebody outside the factory. So the idea is that it's a hope and a dream, but it's actually very rare that it occurs. Okay, now other work. For women, basically working women, but other work. There's other work, not just in the factories for women. Women can become domestic servants, and they could also be working in a business. They could be working in a general store. They could be working for a small, whether it's a family business or just another business. They could be a front counter person. Or perhaps they'll learn that trade. They'll be an upholsterer or a tanner, or maybe they'll be working in a fish shop. It's called a fishmonger. A fishmonger is a person who basically cuts the fish and like takes the scales off of them and stuff like that. So there were other skills that are labor jobs, and once again, they're definitely low-paying jobs, but definitely women would be doing that. Another thing that women could also get involved in or work at is working in a boarding house or working in a tavern or a pub. Once again, low paying, but they're jobs, and it's just going to kind of get you into that cycle of poverty that's hard to get out of. But I'm just trying to give you other examples of other jobs for women to do. Now, I'm going to give you two exceptions to the rule. Perhaps they are deviant women. You're going to have a woman by the name of Sarah Todd Astor. Sarah Todd Astor, or her last name is Todd. Sarah Todd is going to meet John Astor, and they're going to get married. John Astor is a businessman, and he works basically selling skins and furs. And so they're going to be in New York City, and they're going to basically focus on his fur trading business. And Sarah and John are eventually going to have 8 kids, and they're going to have this business, this shop in New York City. Now, the thing is that John Astor is actually going to be away from the shop a lot because he has to go out and basically find the furs and the skins, or at least do the trading that's going to bring them in. And that will leave Sarah very often to basically run the shop and basically run the front counter. And even when John was home, you will often see Sarah running basically the front counter. John Astor, I should say the Astor business, is actually going to do extremely well. And John Astor is basically Sarah and John, but John Astor is going to go down in history as a millionaire in New York City. Over the years, his business is going to do extremely well. He's going to become a very wealthy businessman. And that's how you hear of it. You don't hear much of Sarah. But the fact is that the reason why their fur trading business took off is because they worked in partnership. John wouldn't have been able to do the things that he did if it hadn't been for Sarah, that she basically maintained the business and basically the front office when John was off doing business. So Sarah definitely played a very influential or very important role in the building of this Astor company. And John and Sarah become millionaires, and he'll be one of the first millionaires in New York City and in the United States. Okay, another exception to the rule, or deviant woman, if you will, would be Rebecca Lukens, Lukens. This is she's from Pennsylvania. She and her husband, Rebecca and her husband, owned an iron mill in Pennsylvania. And I would say that they were middle class, and definitely Rebecca definitely helped with the iron mill. And then her husband's going to pass away, and that is going to leave Rebecca to take over the entire company, which she does. And she proves to actually be a very good businesswoman. She will actually expand the iron mill. And when she is running the company herself, railroads are going to take off, and she sees that as a prime opportunity. She expands her company, focusing on selling to the railroad. When she passes away, she'll pass away with over $100,000 in her name, just as in cash. That's not even what the company is worth. And she would consider to be a very wealthy woman at that point in time. Okay, another group of people would be middle class. Now, when you talk about middle class, men are working and women do not have to work. Anything from middle class and above, the men will be working and the women do not have to work. Financially, they do not have to work. When you're talking about middle class, what puts you into middle class? It would be a manager role, managing role, being a supervisor, being in some type of job that takes more of a skill. It may take education. It also may take more of a skill. So you could be an accountant, or even just like a bookkeeper, a school teacher. If you were a doctor would put you into middle class, maybe high middle class to wealthy. A lawyer, eventually there'll be insurance companies. Something like that would put you into middle class. Working at a bank would put you into middle class, and therefore the wives do not have to work. So what do the women do when they're middle class and they don't have to work? It's all about home and all about the family. Yes, they're definitely maintaining their home. They're doing the cooking, but they're really focusing on the kids. They want to make sure their kids are getting educated, both boys and girls. At this point in time, it's easy. Well, most schools will allow girls at this point in time, if you're talking 1800s. But if you're middle class, you might actually be able to afford to have your children tutored privately. And they would really focus on the boys getting educated. Girls, once again, up to the family. It would be like middle school age of education, might be high school, or they would be tutored in some subjects that we would consider to be like college level. The boys, if you're middle class, would definitely be able to go to college, because college at this point in time is not free. You definitely have to pay for college. Okay, other things. So that's what the woman is focusing on, is education. It's also taking the kids and the family to church and making sure that they are religious people. But it's also social events. You're going to kind of plan the social events for the family, play dates for the kids, getting kids to meet other kids, especially when you're older, kind of marrying age. And that would definitely be what a woman would be doing on middle class. Now, another thing with middle class and above, you're going to start to see women be a part of women's clubs, or you're going to see the growth of women's clubs. And so that was something that you see middle class and above definitely getting involved in. It's something for women to do for themselves, but a lot of your women's clubs do things for the community. So you could be in a social club and it is just a social club, or you could be in a social club that is social, but also wants to do things for the community, like create a new park for the community, or, you know, feed the homeless, or that type of thing, kind of more a service, a little more service orientated. Also at this point in time, there's going to be this idea of true womanhood, and this is definitely a slide on your PowerPoint. There's kind of like an expectation of women. I think there's always been an expectation of women, but you're going to get this idea of true womanhood. And true womanhood is kind of like a perfect wife and mother. She should have the proper domestic skills, the proper, or if you want to say perfect domestic skills, values, piety, submissiveness, knowing her place is in the household and taking care of the kids, and letting her husband have the voice for the family, giving his opinion, doing the political thing, doing the working thing, and really knowing her place. But it's also about having the perfect household, the perfect kids, kind of doing the perfect social things. And so there's this kind of concept of kind of this perfectness about women. I think it's always kind of been there, especially start with a Republican motherhood. But once again, it's just kind of like spoken about a little bit more, and that's where you kind of feel that you have to do at this point in time. Okay. What other things? I've already kind of talked about that. That's why I'm kind of hemming and hawing for a moment, because I'm kind of going back into kind of like the perfect domesticity. Men should be the breadwinners. The women should basically rule the private world, and in a sense, kind of have that perfect home. Okay, another thing that you'll also see that's kind of associated with the kind of idea of women and wives, and that is this idea of a delicate woman. A woman having, once again, it's a proper role in society. She's not going to do hard labor unless you're a working person in a factory. But you're not going to, you know, like go plant a tree. You're not going to lift heavy things. That's a man's world. There's like things that women do, and there's things that men do. And there's this idea of kind of a delicate, pretty woman, and she's not going to do anything heavy lifting and stuff like that, and things that would kind of disrupt, I don't know, her being pretty and delicate. And there's certain things women do and certain things men do. Now, does that apply to women who work in the factories? No, not necessarily. It's this real double standard in society. They'll say that there's this perfect womanhood, a true womanhood, and kind of women as a delicate thing, and they'll actually kind of put it on to all women in general, but you can't necessarily do that if you're working in a factory. And maybe you aren't lifting heavy things, but you've been sewing and weaving for 10 hours, and that's actually very strenuous. And this whole idea of a perfect or a true womanhood and having a perfect home and perfect kids can actually apply to working women who knows they can't spend that much time on it, and they're just barely getting by. So there's definitely a lot of double standards, or these standards that just really don't even make sense, that go all over society and doesn't always can apply to other people. Spend on their hands. Okay, now I want to talk, I'm going to move away from like women working. I want to talk about like women's issues. Women's health issues. Women's health issues have always been an issue, but you tend to hear them being talked about a little bit more. Women want more information. Women are kind of trying to talk about them a little bit more. When you talk about women's health issue, the major concern is pregnancy and childbirth. That is definitely a major health issue for women. Women have a shorter life expectancy and they have more health problems, and definitely a lot of it is due to pregnancy and childbirth. Kind of sets them up for potential problems. And women really want to know about birth control and they want to get information, but that is something you don't talk about in society. That is something that is a very private matter, and even though women want to talk about it, they know they can't talk about it in society. So it's something that you talk about very quietly with your girlfriends. You talk about it at the women's meetings, right? Tea on Tuesday. And you try and get information about birth control. The biggest ones at this point in time would be like herbal medicine. You have some type of condoms. There is abortion. That's always extremely, extremely risky. Information is definitely word of mouth, and it's kind of like word of mouth done behind the back door. But women really want to know about this information, but very hard to get to. Divorce is still difficult to get, and there's definitely that double standard with men and women. In the northern states, there's a little bit more opportunity for women to get divorced. It's a little bit easier. I would say it's the easiest to get it in the West, a little bit easier in the North, and still very difficult to get in the South. And so it's still very dependent on the court and kind of on the case. Other things, literature and publishing, middle-class women and above, because they have the time. They have the time to become educated. They also have the time to read. They have the time to look at women's magazines, and there's a few women's magazines coming out. And they have the time to do that. And they definitely are basically looking for it and really enjoy it. You have the American Monthly magazine and the American Ladies magazine. Both of these magazines are geared towards women. But I should say these magazines really promoted domestic duties, how to be a mom, how to be that perfect housewife, that type of thing. You also have Goodies Goddies? It's Godeys, ladies book. That promoted a lot of things. It promoted domestic duties, that type of thing. But it also could promote women getting an education and women going into certain fields like nursing and teaching and social work. And it could promote women expanding their world through education or through like community service. Okay, so speaking of which, education. There's definitely in this time period a push to educate women and for women trying to get more education. And it's also, the education that they get would be a little more comparable to men. They would have subjects such as math and history and geography. This is something that women want and definitely are looking for, and it is definitely being offered a little bit more. A woman by the name of Emma Willard will try to get New York State to improve education for women. She tried for many years, it failed, and she will actually create her own school. The school that she creates is the Troy Female Seminary, 1821. Emma Willard is going to create the Troy Female Seminary in 1821, and this is going to be in New York, the first women's high school. Another woman, Catherine Beecher, promoted education up into and through the 1920s, and she will create the Hartford Female Seminary. And then in 1830, she'll create the Western Female Institute in Cincinnati. Now, once again, I just want to remind you that when you hear about schools for women, many times in the title, they're known as seminary. It's just a term. It has nothing to do with religion whatsoever. Okay, another woman, Mary Lyon, 1837, argued for separate colleges. Colleges were first starting out for women, and she said that there should be colleges for men, colleges for women, and also colleges for women should promote the same or have the same type of education as men. Mary Lyon is going to create Mount Holyoke. This is going to be in Massachusetts. It's still with us today. And she created a 3-year study program for women. And by 1849, she will create a teacher training program. Now, having talked about that, women really have always been teachers because they're teaching their kids, and that is definitely a field that women will go into. And there will definitely be a huge push over the years for women to become educated and to become teachers. Beecher and Lyon, both those women will definitely promote the idea of teacher training programs. And you will see many women go into that position. Even though the pay was below male teachers, if you had male and female teachers at the same school teaching the same thing, women would automatically be paid less. But the idea was that women would teach, and they would teach until they got married. And then once they got married, you don't really see a whole lot of married teachers. Usually it was when you were single. And then some women, for whatever reason, if they chose not to marry or if they never found the perfect person, you would actually see some teachers that will teach basically until they retire, and they would be single ladies. At this point in time, you really don't see married women be teachers. The arts and entertainment. Women had a huge amount of talent and huge amount of creativity, but really you don't see women like going to art school or having training as an artist. The things that women did on their own and being artists and being creative in various ways, they were a lot of self-taught, self-learned. There weren't really any programs at this point in time for women. Okay, moral reform. This is something that's going to be big in this time period. There's going to be this wave of kind of moral reform throughout the country. Women will definitely be a big part of this moral reform movement in the United States. So women were seen as moral and pious people. So it kind of makes sense that they get into this moral reform movement and kind of them promoting this moral reform in society. Okay, there will be what's known as moral reform societies, and they're going to be all over the country. Some examples would be Boston, New York, New Jersey will have their various moral reform societies. One specific would be the Boston Female Moral Reform Society. That's just an example. They have them, as I said, all over. You usually tend to see them in larger cities. Okay, some other forms of moral reforms. Okay, temperance movement. Temperance movement has been around for a very long time. Temperance movement is the idea of getting rid of alcohol. No, do not make it, do not sell it, do not drink it. You'll see a lot of women within the temperance movement. Why? Because women get married to alcoholics who basically drink their money away, or there's a lot of abuse, and so you'll see women being major supporters of the temperance movement. Temperance movement is nothing new in this time period. There's temperance movement like in the early 1800s, so it's not anything new, but there tends to be this wave of it. The abolitionist movement is definitely considered to be a moral reform. Abolitionist movement slash anti-slavery would be moral reforms at this point in time. A woman getting to the abolitionist movement, Lydia Maria Child, her last name Child, wrote the first American anti-slavery book in 1833. So Lydia Maria Child wrote the first American anti-slavery book in 1833. It was called An Appeal for That Class of American Called Africans. And this book basically was calling for justice and equality. She also edited the National Anti-Slavery Standard. Okay, another woman, Prudence Crandall. Prudence Crandall is a Quaker. She was raised a Quaker, practices as a Quaker. She will accept African American students into her Canterbury Female Boarding School. And she was very much about promoting education for African American children. Now, even though she accepted African American students for her Canterbury Female Boarding School, she had a huge amount of criticism to it. She will later open up a high school for young colored ladies and misses. This is in 1830 or near 1833, around 1833, because in 1833 she will actually be arrested for teaching African American students. Now this is going to be in Massachusetts, okay? So this is in the North, okay? And so she's still being arrested for teaching African Americans even though it was in the North. This is 1833. So she gets jailed for it, and that is basically the final straw for her. She is done. She's done with schools. She basically kind of packs up her bags, which is it's very saddening when you think she's just trying to make a better life for people. But at that point in time, it was kind of more than she could take. Okay, now, other people I want to talk about, the Grimke sisters, Grimke sisters. It is Sarah and Angelina. They are going to be a part of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. They are going to lecture and write extensively about the abolitionist movement. Angelina Grimke, in 1837, she will write that slavery in the South hurt the whole nation and that slavery could no longer be ignored. This will be in an essay. It's called An Appeal to the Women of the Nominally Free States. So I'll repeat that. That concept she will write about in an essay. It's called An Appeal to the Women of the Nominally Free States. Sarah and Angelina will write and lecture extensively on the abolitionist movement. They will write and lecture extensively on the women's suffrage movement and the women's rights movement. Okay, another group of people that I want to talk about moving out west, kind of changing our focus and moving out west, is Native Americans. As Americans moved westward, they definitely are going to come in contact with more tribes. Women will definitely find themselves in more contact with the Native Americans. And once again, it's a personal reaction. What I'm speaking to is more of the positive relationships of them learning from each other. American women learning new techniques and new things, learning about herbal medicine, and vice versa, that the American women are showing them tools, cooking tools, things that they're doing. So in that sense, you see them having a positive relationship. Another thing that I do still want to mention is that Native American women will be used extensively as guides in the West. That's kind of one of their roles, usually one of their roles, and Americans will hire them as guides out as they move out west. Now, on a negative note, in 1830, President Jackson is going to have a policy of moving Indians west, and it's known as the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 will be from 1830 to 1838. And what he's going to do is he's going to force what's referred to as the 5 civilized tribes to move from the east into the west, and a western region of Oklahoma Territory, which is just right over or across the Mississippi River, or west of the Mississippi River. The 5 tribes that will be affected are what are known as the 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Seminole, and the Chickasaw. These are known as the 5 civilized tribes because that's how the Americans refer to them, is because these 5 tribes have adopted more American ways, or have adopted more of the American ways compared to other tribes. So the Americans refer to them as the 5 civilized tribes. These tribes were forced to move. They are moved basically through the elements. It doesn't matter if it's winter or summer, they're moving them. They're moving them by wagon or horseback. And it is an estimated, I have numbers about 17% of the population will die of disease or like malnutrition during their journeys into Oklahoma City. You'll see a huge amount of disease, malnutrition, they're not eating as right, exposure to the elements sets them up for disease. Especially the elderly and the very young, as in infants and children. Another thing is you're going to see an outbreak of smallpox whenever they moved. And one of the concepts which is widely accepted in American history is that they were given blankets that had been used with smallpox patients. And that would definitely basically kind of create this smallpox outbreak. If that is true, then the government knew exactly what they were doing. And they were, in a sense, setting them up to become sick and potentially die, which is a very sad story. This is what you will hear about the Trail of Tears. That is the Cherokees' basically history and their story of this moving west. Very sad story. Okay, another group, Spanish-speaking, Hispanic Spanish-speaking people out west. Spain will lose control of Mexico, and Mexico will become known as Mexico or the Mexican government in 1821. The Mexican government opened up land to settlers. They were very encouraging to settlers, and you'll actually see a lot of Americans moving into what we know today as the region of Texas, which would be at this point in time controlled by Mexico. And then also you have California, which will also be controlled, had been controlled by Spain, then controlled by Mexico. And you'll see a lot of Americans moving into California, once again being in Mexico territory. There was availability of land, and Americans will basically take them on it. But what you see with that is you see this blending of culture. You see a lot of the adopting of Hispanic, Spanish, Mexican culture, the blending of the language. You have the culture that will come, the food that will come, the Catholic religion that will definitely just be adopted into society or just a part of society. There's, I thought, one other thing I was going to say about that blending. You're going to have mixed marriages, or kind of the blending of relationships, and you'll definitely see a blending of and mixed marriages. But I think it's more, I guess, kind of the emphasis of just kind of the adoption of the culture, and especially we live in California, and we know there's this just this blend of culture, whether it's kind of language, food, the lifestyle, like the way the houses are built and the ways that you kind of just live in it. Oh, I know. And also you're going to see a large amount of rancheros, especially in California, even out west if you're talking from Texas all the way into California. But rancheros were very popular. And you see this coming of the ranches, which can make huge money, which many Americans will become a part of when they move out west. Okay, one last one, just about women in general moving westward. It's kind of the same thing that I had mentioned before. Women were coming with family, whether it's a husband or as children. They're moving out west. They kind of have to figure out how to live out west. A lot of times they bring a lot of stuff and realize they can't bring that much. And when they do set up home in their homes in the West, it's usually a very basic type of home with a very basic types of pots and pans and plates, just because that's all they have, especially in the very beginning. And over time, it would be kind of built upon if you, from that point in time. When you're talking about the 1830s into the 1840s, there's going to be this movement to move westward, to move past the Rocky Mountains. This is when you're starting to move into California. There will be like the Oregon Trail and the California Trail and the Spanish Trail that will take the settlers, men and women, out west. But once again, women moving out west, no matter where they go, it's a lot to do, because they have to help the man with the ranch or the farming. They got to take care of the kids, the household. They have to maybe hunt or at least prepare the meat. They have to figure out if they can get thread or cloth and make all the clothes. And so it's a very demanding lifestyle. Okay, other things. And talking about out west, relatively out west, Ohio, 1833, Oberlin College in Ohio is actually going to, or Oberlin College in Ohio is going to create a program for women. So women were allowed in Oberlin College, and this is going to be one of the first colleges out west that will allow women. Many women will go to Oberlin College just because of the availability of a college program for them. They will also have a really great teaching program, and then over time they'll expand that teaching program, and a lot of women will go through their teaching program. Once again, I know I'm kind of repeating myself, but once again, divorce is much easier in the Western states, all the various Western states. I think they really see that women are really participating and doing a whole lot in society, and in a sense, they're kind of giving them credit for that, and in a sense, and respect for that. African Americans moving west. Sometimes they're moving west with their masters. And so, it's really hit and miss on slavery in the West. As further you move west, there's less slavery. It depends on where you go. But you can definitely still have some slave states out west. And so some are moving into slave territories with their masters. Some are actually moving into free territories with their masters, and it's just this kind of quasi life kind of thing. But also you see African Americans running away, or if they're free, they move out west, because to get out west is a whole lot easier to kind of lose yourself. And so that is a draw for them. But remember, still, there's still a lot of prejudices. They still have no rights, even if they're in a free territory, free state. But they usually find jobs, definitely labor jobs, so it's definitely not an easy life, but usually some way, shape, or form. Domestic servants, working on ranches, so they're able to, in a sense, support themselves. Now, here is one case that would be kind of a deviant woman. A deviant woman, or definitely not the norm. Rachel, I only have her name as Rachel. She was a slave, and she was in Minnesota, and she will sue for her freedom, and she will actually be granted her freedom. She will become free in 1834. And this will actually set a precedence case. And so there will be cases that will be based on this in the West and in Minnesota and other Western states that would be able to grant slaves their freedom. So that's kind of a good move for her, and also will help other people across the line. All right, so that is the end of that lecture, and kind of sums up this time period of life after, or kind of 1814 to 1830.